starting with number 1, Polikarpov I-16. Soviet Union, 1934. The I-16 entered Soviet service as one of the first low-wing monoplane fighters in the world, and by the time Germany invaded in 1941, it was the backbone of Soviet fighter regiments. Its stubby fuselage and manually retracted landing gear gave it speed, but made it brutally unforgiving in turns, snapping into spins that killed inexperienced pilots before they ever saw an enemy aircraft. When Operation Barbarossa began, hundreds were destroyed on the ground in the opening hours, and the survivors that took off were outclassed by the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Pilots who had mastered its quirks respected it. Those who had not rarely lived long enough to learn. 2. Breda BA-65, Italy, 1936. Italy built the BA-65 as a heavy ground attack aircraft for colonial wars in East Africa, later sending it into the North African campaign. Its thick fuselage and limited cockpit visibility made low-level strafing runs dangerous, and its weight left it underpowered for the engines available to Italian industry. Mechanical failures grounded aircraft faster than combat losses could explain, and by 1941 the type had been pulled from frontline units after suffering disproportionate attrition against British fighters and ground fire. The pilots assigned to the BA-65 understood they were flying a machine that struggled to outrun the dangers it was sent to face. 3. Caproni CA-135, Italy, 1936. The CA-135 was meant to be a modern Italian medium bomber, but its Piaggio engines proved chronically unreliable from the moment squadrons began flying it. Crews reported engine fires and sudden power loss on training flights long before the aircraft saw combat, and Italian command quietly withdrew it from frontline bomber groups within a few years of introduction. Air crews lost to mechanical failure outnumbered those lost to enemy fire, a statistic that effectively ended the type's combat career. It became a cautionary example of how rushing an aircraft into service without resolving engine reliability could cost a service its own men. 4. Ferry Battle, United Kingdom, 1937. Britain's Ferry Battle was a single-engine light bomber sent into France in 1940, expecting to strike advancing German columns. On May 14, 1940, squadrons attacking the bridges at Sedan suffered catastrophic losses, with roughly 40% of the attacking force shot down in a single mission. Its slow speed, light defensive armament, and lack of fighter escort left crews almost defenseless against German flak and fighters. Pilots who survived described the missions as near suicidal, flying straight and level into concentrated anti-aircraft fire with no way to evade. The battle was withdrawn from daylight bombing duties soon after, its reputation sealed by the scale of its losses. 5. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, Germany, 1937. The Stuka earned fame for its terrifying dive-bombing attacks in Poland and France, where weak air defenses let it operate almost unopposed. That reputation collapsed during the Battle of Britain, where its fixed landing gear and modest speed turned it into easy prey for Hurricanes and Spitfires once it lacked overwhelming fighter cover. Losses mounted quickly enough that the Luftwaffe pulled it from daylight operations over Britain entirely within weeks. The aircraft that had symbolized Blitzkrieg success became a symbol of how quickly air superiority could reverse a weapon's fortunes, surviving afterward mainly on the Eastern Front, where Soviet fighter strength was thinner. 6. Fiat CR.42 Falco, Italy, 1939. Italy still fielded biplane fighters as the rest of the world moved to monoplanes, and the CR.42 was sent into the Battle of Britain and the North African campaign, carrying that disadvantage with it. Its open cockpit and fixed gear gave it grace in the air, but no answer to the speed of modern opposition. Italian pilots flying alongside the Luftwaffe over England in late 1940 found themselves consistently outrun and outgunned, suffering losses that achieved little strategically. The CR.42 remained agile and pleasant to fly, but agility could not compensate for a fundamental generational gap against enemy fighters built a decade later. 7. Blackburn Bota, United Kingdom, 1939. The Bota was designed as a torpedo bomber for Coastal Command, but its cramped cockpit gave pilots dangerously poor visibility, particularly to the rear and below, exactly where torpedo attacks required clear sight lines. Underpowered engines left it sluggish and difficult to control at low speed, and operational squadrons quickly reported it unfit for the missions it was built for. Relegated to training duties, the BWII continued killing crews there, its handling characteristics proving just as unforgiving for student pilots as for operational ones. Few aircraft of the war earned a reputation for danger so quickly and from so many different roles. 8. Boulton-Paul Defiant, United Kingdom, 1939. Britain built the Defiant around a power-operated turret instead of forward-firing guns, betting that German fighter pilots would not recognize the difference until it was too late. The tactic worked briefly during the Battle of Britain, when Luftwaffe pilots mistook it for a Hurricane and approached from front, directly into its turret's field of fire. Once that mistake stopped happening, the result reversed completely. On July 19, 1940 alone, a Defiant squadron lost several aircraft attacking from the rear quarter the turret could not protect. Daylight losses became unsustainable, and the type was reassigned to night fighting, where its lack of forward guns mattered less. 9. Messerschmitt Bf-110 Germany, 1939. Conceived as a long-range destroyer fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, the Bf-110 proved too heavy and unmaneuverable to survive against single-engine opposition during the Battle of Britain. Spitfires and Hurricanes turned inside it with ease, and squadrons that had expected to protect German bombers instead needed protection themselves. Losses climbed through the summer of 1940 until the Luftwaffe scaled back its use as a daylight escort fighter. The aircraft eventually found a more survivable role as a night fighter, where darkness erased the speed disadvantage that had made it so vulnerable by day. 10. Brewster F-28 Buffalo, United States, 1939. The Buffalo performed respectably in Finnish hands against early Soviet aircraft, but American and Commonwealth pilots flying it elsewhere found a very different aircraft. Heavy, underpowered, and plagued by landing gear and engine troubles, it struggled against modern Japanese fighters in the Pacific. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Marine Corps Buffalo squadrons were nearly wiped out attacking incoming Japanese aircraft, with most shot down and many pilots killed. Survivors described it afterward as a machine that should never have been sent into that fight, a verdict the casualty figures from Midway made difficult to dispute. 11. Westland Whirlwind, United Kingdom, 1940. Britain's twin-engine Whirlwind showed real promise as a heavily armed fighter, but it relied on Rolls-Royce Peregrine engines that never received the development investment given to the company's other engine programs. Reliability problems plagued squadrons throughout the aircraft's short service life, with engine failures grounding aircraft and endangering crews on missions far from base. Production of the Peregrine engine ended before the airframe's potential could be realized, leaving only a small number of Whirlwinds in service. Pilots who flew it valued its firepower, but learned to treat its engines with constant suspicion, aware that failure could come without warning. 12. Messerschmitt Me-210 Germany, 1941. Germany designed the Me-210 to replace the aging Bf-110, but early test flights revealed a violent tendency to enter uncontrollable spins and tumbles with little warning. Several test and training pilots were killed before the scale of the instability was acknowledged within the program. Production was halted while engineers reworked the airframe, an enormously costly delay for a wartime aircraft industry that could not afford wasted years. The aircraft eventually evolved into the more stable Me-410, but the Me-210 itself stood as a stark lesson in how an aerodynamic flaw could kill pilots long before it reached an enemy. 13. LAG-3, Soviet Union, 1941. Built largely from wood due to wartime aluminum shortages, the LAG-3 was heavy for its power and sluggish in maneuvers that Soviet pilots desperately needed against the Bf-109. Its handling earned it a grim nickname among its own pilots, a play on its factory initials that translated roughly to Varnished Guaranteed Coffin. Loss rates were severe through 1941 and 1942, particularly among newer pilots who lacked the experience to compensate for its poor climb rate and sluggish controls. Soviet industry eventually redesigned the airframe into the far more capable A-5, but the LAG-3's reputation among the men who flew it never really recovered. 14. Bell P-39 Airacobra, United States, 1941. The Airacobra's mid-mounted engine and nose wheel landing gear were unusual for the era, but the design carried a dangerous flaw. Under certain conditions, it could snap into a flat spin from which recovery was extremely difficult. Several pilots died in training accidents tied directly to this characteristic. Without a turbocharger, it also performed poorly at high altitude, making it a liability in the European air war fought largely above 20,000 feet. It found a genuine niche fighting at low altitude on the Eastern Front through Lend-Lease, where Soviet pilots used its firepower effectively, but American and British units regarded it with lasting caution. 15. Brewster SB-2A Buccaneer, United States, 1941. Brewster's dive bomber arrived overweight and underpowered, with handling so poor that it never saw meaningful American combat service. Most production aircraft were relegated to training units, where their sluggish controls and weak structural margins made them unpopular and occasionally dangerous to fly. The Buccaneer's failure compounded existing problems at Brewster, a company already struggling with quality control across its other aircraft programs. Within a few years, the company's military contracts were canceled and its factories shut down, and the SB-2A stood as one more example of a design that never justified the resources spent building it. 16. Vultee A-31 Vengeance, United States, 1942. The Vengeance was built as a dive bomber on a scale that made it an unusually large and visible target, with stall and spin tendencies that demanded careful handling during the steep dives its mission required. American commanders largely declined to use it in frontline combat after early evaluation revealed these problems, instead routing most production to Australian and Indian Air Force units fighting in secondary theaters. Pilots who flew it respected its bomb load, but treated its low-speed handling with real caution, aware that a mishandled dive could turn deadly before a single enemy shot was fired. 17. Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, United States, 1942. Nicknamed the Beast by the crews forced to fly it, the early Helldiver suffered from structural weakness in its tail section that sometimes failed under the stress of a steep dive. Hundreds of design changes were demanded after fleet introduction, an almost unprecedented number for an aircraft already in production. Carrier pilots found it unpredictable at low landing speeds, and accident rates during the type's first year in service reflected those concerns. Later production blocks resolved most of the structural issues, and the Helldiver eventually became an effective dive bomber. But its early reputation as a dangerous, unfinished aircraft lingered among the men who flew its first versions. 18. Heinkel He-177 Greif, Germany, 1942. Germany's only operational heavy bomber used an unusual configuration pairing two engines to drive a single propeller shaft on each wing, a solution that frequently overheated and caught fire in flight. Crews nicknamed the Luftwaffe's Leiter, a dark joke reflecting how many aircraft were lost to engine fires rather than enemy action. The unreliability undermined Germany's already limited strategic bombing capability, grounding aircraft for repairs far more often than missions required. Pilots assigned to the Greif treated long flights with a wariness usually reserved for enemy territory, knowing the greater danger might come from their own engines. 19. Nakajima-ki 44 Shoki, Japan, 1942. Built as a fast home defense interceptor against high-altitude American bombers, the Shoki carried unusually high wing loading that made it demanding to fly well. Its high landing speed caused a steady stream of accidents among pilots without extensive training, and average squadron pilots often struggled to extract the performance the aircraft was capable of. In skilled hands, it proved a genuinely effective interceptor against B-29 raids late in the war, but the gap between its potential and what an ordinary pilot could safely achieve meant training losses ran high throughout its service life. 20. Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, Japan, 1942. The Raiden was designed for speed and climb rate to intercept Allied bombers, but its engine cooling system caused persistent overheating problems, and its landing gear proved fragile enough to collapse under routine use. Maintenance crews struggled to keep aircraft serviceable, and production numbers stayed limited as reliability issues slowed delivery to home defense squadrons. Pilots found it powerful when functioning correctly, but unpredictable when it was not. An uncertainty that mattered enormously for an interceptor expected to launch quickly against incoming raids. Its operational record never matched the ambitions of its design. 21. Vought F-4U Corsair, United States, 1942. The Corsair's long nose gave it superb speed, but blocked a pilot's forward view during landing. And its main landing gear had a tendency to bounce on touchdown, sending the aircraft skipping unpredictably across a carrier deck. Training accidents during this period were severe enough that the type earned the nickname Ensign Eliminator among new naval aviators, and the Navy initially barred it from carrier operations, assigning it instead to Marine Corps land bases. Engineers eventually corrected the bounce and visibility problems, and the Corsair became one of the finest fighters of the war. But its early reputation for killing inexperienced pilots before they ever reached combat was well earned. 22. Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, Germany, 1944. The rocket-powered Comet could climb faster than any propeller fighter of its era, but its fuel, a combination of two highly volatile chemicals, could explode on contact with skin, clothing, or a hard landing impact. More pilots were killed in training and ground accidents from fuel-related explosions than were ever lost to enemy fighters. Powered flight lasted only minutes before the engine had to be shut down, leaving the aircraft to glide back for a dangerous unpowered landing on a skid undercarriage that offered no margin for error. Pilots who volunteered for the program understood they were flying one of the deadliest aircraft in the Luftwaffe regardless of whether they ever engaged the enemy. 23. Fieseler Fi-103, R. Reichenberg, Germany, 1944. Built as a piloted version of the V-1 flying bomb, the Reichenberg was designed from the outset as a one-way weapon, with almost no realistic means for the pilot to escape before impact. Test and training flights killed a number of pilots due to its unstable controls and the near impossibility of safely exiting the cockpit at the speeds involved. Even within a wartime program built around mass sacrifice, German commanders ultimately hesitated to deploy it operationally in numbers, recognizing that it offered its pilots essentially no chance of survival for uncertain military gain. 24. Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, Japan, 1945. The Oka was never meant to bring its pilot home. Carried beneath a bomber toward an Allied fleet and then released to rocket toward its target, it offered no realistic chance of survival once launched, a fact understood by every pilot who volunteered for the program. Allied sailors nicknamed it the Baka, meaning fool, after recognizing what it represented. Many of the bombers carrying it were shot down before they could even release their Oka, costing additional aircrew lives for a weapon that ultimately sank relatively few ships against the number of pilots it consumed. It remains one of the starkest examples in the war of an aircraft whose entire design accepted the death of its pilot as the price of the mission. If there's another World War II aircraft you think belongs among these flying death traps, share it in the comments below. For more stories about the machines that shaped the war, for better or worse, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.